I stood frozen behind the weathered wooden gate, the warm glass dish of peach cobbler clutched in my steady hands, when her words sliced through the evening air like a hidden knife. Why is she even still alive? The laugh that followed, my daughter-in-law's joined by my son's, wasn't loud, but it shattered something deep inside me, turning invisibility into a weapon I could no longer ignore. The summer air hung heavy with the scent of grilled meat and citronella, the backyard alive with the clatter of plates and the hum of voices. Mabel stood just beyond the wooden gate, her hands wrapped around a glass dish of peach cobbler, its warmth seeping through her fingers. The cobbler was still fresh from the oven, a labor of love she'd spent the morning perfecting, slicing ripe peaches, measuring sugar with care, and crimping the crust just so. It was her offering, her way of weaving herself into the fabric of the family gathering. She hadn't been explicitly invited, but she'd assumed her presence was a given. She was Carl's mother, after all, the grandmother to Ruby and Trent, the woman who'd always shown up with something to share. Yet as she paused at the gate, adjusting her grip on the dish, Jody's voice sliced through the evening like a shard of glass. Why is she even still alive? The words weren't loud, but they were sharp, deliberate, and laced with a disdain that felt like a physical blow. Mabel froze, her breath catching in her throat. The laugh that followed Jody's, joined by a softer chuckle she recognized as Carl's, wasn't raucous, but it cut deeper than any shout. It was the kind of laugh that slipped out when someone thought they were safe, unheard, their cruelty cloaked by the noise of the party. Mabel's heart thudded, not with shock, but with a slow, heavy recognition. Something deep within her cracked, not in a way that shattered her, but in a way that let light into a place she'd kept dark for too long. She stood there, hidden by the gate's shadow, her hands steady despite the storm brewing inside. The cobbler dish felt heavier now, its warmth no longer comforting but burdensome, a symbol of her misplaced effort. She could have turned back, retreated to the quiet of her own home, where the silence was familiar, if not kind. But retreat wasn't in her nature. Not yet, not before she faced what she'd heard. Mabel straightened her shoulders, her spine aching from years of carrying more than her share, and pushed through the gate. The creak of the hinges went unnoticed, drowned by the music blaring from a portable speaker, some fast-paced song she didn't recognize, too young for her 72 years. The backyard was a tableau of familiarity and estrangement. String lights swayed gently above picnic tables laden with food, potato salad, burgers, and a bowl of chips already going stale. Faces turned briefly toward her, then away, as if her arrival was an interruption rather than an event. Some were family, her cousin's daughter and nephew she hadn't seen in years. Others were strangers, friends of Jody or Carl, their laughter easy and exclusive. No one smiled at her, no one called out a greeting. The air felt thick, not just with heat, but with the weight of her invisibility. She clutched the cobbler tighter, its glass edges pressing into her palms, grounding her. "Oh, Mabel, we didn't know you were coming," Jody said, her voice now syrupy with surprise, her eyes flicking to the dish as if it were an inconvenience. Mabel recognized the tone, the same one Jody used when answering the door to an unexpected delivery. "I brought cobbler," Mabel replied, her voice steady but quieter than she intended. No one offered to take the dish, and no one cleared a space on the table. She moved through the crowd, past the clinking bottles and the chatter, feeling like a ghost in her own family's story. She found a spot at the far end of a table where a folding chair wobbled under her weight. Her back ached, but she sat up straight, refusing to let her body betray the turmoil inside. The gathering unfolded around her, a scene she'd once been central to, but now observed from the edges. Carl, her son, stood near the grill, his broad shoulders slouched in a way that reminded her of his teenage years when he'd sulk over math homework at her kitchen table. He raised a beer, his voice carrying over the crowd, to family. Glasses clinked, laughter rose, but no one looked her way. Not Carl, not Jody, not even her grandchildren, who darted past in a blur of energy, their sneakers kicking up dust. Ruby, 16, with her mother's sharp jawline, didn't pause. Trent, 12, didn't even glance. Mabel wondered if they saw her at all, or if she'd become just a fixture, like the old oak tree in the corner of the yard, noticed only when it dropped leaves on the lawn. She watched them eat, laugh, and drink, their lives moving forward without her. The cobbler sat untouched, its golden crust cooling in the evening air. She'd made it for them, as she'd always done, baking, mending, giving, her love poured into every gesture. She'd brought gummy worms in Ziploc bags for the kids, stayed up late sewing Halloween costumes, and driven across town for last-minute school pickups. But now, sitting at the table's edge, she saw it clearly. Her love had been taken, not treasured. Jody approached once, her smile tight and practiced, the kind she wore for photos. "Did you want a plate?" she asked, already turning away. "I'm fine," Mabel said, and Jody nodded, retreating before the words fully settled. Mabel stayed until the end, not out of hope, but out of stubbornness. She stacked plates, folded napkins, and wiped sticky rings from the table with a damp paper towel, tasks that felt like muscle memory. The others drifted indoors, their voices fading, leaving her alone under the dimming string lights. She picked up her empty dish, still warm from the sun, and walked out of the backyard. The gate creaked shut behind her, and with it something in her shifted, not with anger or sorrow, but with a decision. She wouldn't be invisible anymore. That moment at the gate wasn't just about Jody's words. It was the culmination of years of being sidelined, tolerated rather than welcomed. Mabel had spent decades pouring herself into her family, Carl's education, his house, his children, only to find herself on the outside, her presence an afterthought. The remark crystallized a truth she'd avoided. She was no longer necessary to them, not as a mother, not as a grandmother, not as a person. But she was still here, still alive, and that life demanded reckoning. In the days that followed, Mabel didn't cry or rage. She moved with purpose, pulling out the folder labeled Carl's house from her filing cabinet, rereading the deed, the gift letter, and the $40,000 she'd given without strings. She called Lena, a sharp-witted acquaintance from her bridge days, and laid out her questions about property and estates. She dressed with care for that meeting, choosing slacks and a coat that felt like armor. Lena's words, "You're not powerless," lit a spark. Mabel began to untangle herself from the roles she'd played, the giver, the supporter, and the one who waited for invitations that never came. Jody's remark wasn't just a wound. It was a mirror reflecting a family that had moved on without her. But it was also a catalyst, waking Mabel to the truth that her life belonged to her, not to those who dismissed her. She started with small acts, changing locks, updating accounts, but each was a step toward reclaiming her dignity. The cobbler dish, washed and put away, became a symbol not of rejection, but of her resolve to stop offering pieces of herself to those who wouldn't receive them. She baked for herself now, a blueberry pie with a crust she'd perfected over decades, not for a family event, but for the simple joy of it. The shift wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, like the way dawn creeps in, unnoticed until the light is undeniable. Mabel's perspective changed not because she stopped loving her family, but because she started loving herself more. She saw the years she'd spent waiting for Carl to call, for Ruby to smile, for Jody to soften, and decided she was done. She wasn't erasing them. She was rewriting her own story, one where she was the center, not a guest at someone else's table. The gate, the cobbler, Jody's words, they were the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, where Mabel would live, not just survive, with her hands unclenched and her heart wide open to herself. The Sunday after the gathering dawned gray and unremarkable, the kind of morning where the world outside Mabel's window seemed to hold its breath. She woke early, not from habit, but from a restlessness that had settled in her bones overnight, like damp rot in old wood. The house was quiet, too quiet, the silence amplifying the echo of Jody's words from the backyard. Why is she even still alive? Mabel lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling fan's lazy spin, its blades cutting through air that felt thicker than it should. She was 72, not ancient, not frail, yet in that family yard she'd felt like a relic, dusted off and set aside, invisible. The word lodged in her chest, not as anger, but as a dull ache, the kind that comes from loving too hard and being seen too little. She rose slowly, her joints protesting with familiar creaks, and padded to the kitchen in her robe. The coffee pot gurgled to life, filling the room with a bitter, comforting aroma. Just 1 cup today. No need for more, no one to share it with. She carried it to the table by the window, the same scarred oak where Carl had once hunched over algebra textbooks, his pencil scratching furiously while she sliced apples for his snack. Back then, her presence was a given, a steady orbit around his world. Now she sipped the coffee, black and scalding, and watched a squirrel dart across the lawn. The yard needed mowing, she noted absently, but the thought evaporated as her gaze drifted to the filing cabinet in the corner of the living room, half hidden behind a potted fern she'd forgotten to water. That cabinet was a tomb of sorts, stuffed with the detritus of a life poured into others. Report cards yellowed at the edges, Frank's old insurance policies, and recipes clipped from newspapers long defunct. And there, in the bottom drawer, was the folder labeled Carl's house. Mabel set her mug down, the ceramic clinking sharply against the wood. She hadn't touched it in years, not since the closing, when she'd handed over the check for $40 from her retirement savings, her hands trembling not from fear, but from a fierce, foolish hope. Just to help you get started, she'd told him, pressing the paper into his palm as if it were a talisman against the world's uncertainties. No strings, she'd insisted, because that's what mothers do, they give without tallying the cost. But now, in the harsh light of that invisibility, those strings felt like chains, binding her to a role she'd outgrown. She crossed to the cabinet, her bare feet cold on the linoleum, and knelt to pull open the drawer. Dust motes danced in the slanting sunlight, and the folder felt heavier than she remembered, its manila cover warped from humidity. Mabel carried it back to the table, spreading the contents like a deck of cards in a solitary game of solitaire. First, the purchase agreement, crisp and formal, dated 15 years back. She traced the signatures, hers, Carl's, and Jody's, with a fingertip, the ink faded but indelible. The house had been a fixer-upper then, a modest two-story with peeling paint and a sagging porch, but she'd seen potential in it, the way she'd seen potential in Carl when he was a scrawny boy with scraped knees and dreams of engineering school. "This is your fresh start," she'd said at the kitchen table that night after the realtor left. Carl had hugged her awkwardly, his arms loose around her shoulders. "Thanks, Mom. We couldn't do this without you." Next came the deed, transferred solely to Carl and Jody, her name absent from the title like an erasure. Mabel's breath hitched as she read the fine print, the legalese blurring slightly through the sting in her eyes. She'd gifted the down payment outright, no lien, no co-ownership, a gesture of pure, unadulterated faith, and the letter she'd attached handwritten on her best stationery, the one with the embossed roses at the top. She unfolded it carefully, the paper crackling like dry leaves. "Because you're my son," she'd written, "and this is what family does. No repayment expected, no conditions. Build your life here and know I'm proud." The words mocked her now, their optimism a naive echo in the empty kitchen. Proud of what? A son who toasted to family without glancing her way. A life built on her sacrifice, yet one where she was relegated to the edges, a polite afterthought at best. Memories flooded in as she sifted through the papers, unbidden and vivid. The day they'd moved in, Mabel arrived at dawn with boxes of her china. Frank's china, really, the set they'd registered for in '68, and spent hours unpacking while Jody directed from the couch, her belly swollen with Trent. "You're a lifesaver, Mabel," Jody had said, but her tone was clipped, as if the help was expected, not appreciated. Mabel had scrubbed the grout in the bathroom until her knuckles bled and painted the nursery walls a soft blue because Carl mentioned the baby might be a boy. And later, when the roof leaked during that brutal storm in '09, she'd written another check $5 this time, for repairs, insisting it was nothing, just family helping family. But where was that reciprocity now? Where was the call on a rainy afternoon, the invitation to Sunday supper without the undercurrent of obligation? The ache deepened, twisting into something sharper, not quite rage, but a profound disillusionment. She'd spent decades like this, boring herself into the cracks of their lives, filling the spaces they left empty, babysitting until her hips screamed, baking pies for birthdays she wasn't truly part of, and driving Ruby to dance class when Jody's schedule overflowed. All while her own world shrank. Frank has been gone 12 years now, her friends scattering like leaves in autumn, her days measured in errands for others rather than pursuits for herself, invisible. The word repeated, a mantra of neglect. At the gathering, it hadn't been the words alone that wounded her. It was the confirmation of a slow fading, a life deferred until it nearly dissolved. Mabel closed her eyes, the papers fanned out before her like a map to a territory she'd lost. But maps could be redrawn. Resolve stirred, tentative at first, like a seed pushing through frozen soil. She wouldn't beg for visibility, she would claim it. No more waiting for seats at tables that weren't set for her. No more gifts doled out like crumbs to sate her own loneliness. This house, their house built on her back, had been the cornerstone of her giving, the emblem of her self-erasure. If she couldn't reclaim the bricks, she could at least audit the mortar and ensure no more of her foundation crumbled unnoticed. She reached for her phone, fingers hovering over Carl's number before veering away. No, not him, not yet. Instead, she scrolled to Lena's contact, a woman she'd met at Bridge Club a decade ago, Shar, pied and widowed herself, with a career in probate that made her the unwitting keeper of secrets and settlements. They'd exchanged pleasantries over the years, recipes, condolences, but never more until now. Mabel's thumb pressed the call button before doubt could intervene. The line rang twice. "Lena, it's Mabel Hemsworth from the Bridge." A pause, then Lena's voice, warm but efficient. "Mabel, good to hear from you. What's on your mind?" I have questions about property transfers, gifts, and estate things. The house I helped my son buy." Another pause, longer this time, but Lena didn't pry. "Bring what you've got. Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. Mabel exhaled, the sound ragged in the quiet kitchen. "I'll be there." She hung up, her hand steadier now, and began gathering the documents back into the folder. But not before penning a note on a scrap of paper, tucked inside, no more blindly. It wasn't dramatic, just a quiet vow. That afternoon, she didn't call Carl and didn't text Jody with forced cheer. She walked to the corner store instead, bought a lemon for her tea, and sat on the porch as the sky bruised purple. The street hummed with life, kids on scooters, a dog barking at shadows, but for the first time in years, Mabel felt the pull of her own pulse, steady and insistent. By evening, the resolve had hardened. She ironed her slacks, polished her good shoes, and laid out the coat with the pearl buttons, the one Frank had called her armor. Tomorrow wasn't just a meeting, it was a reclamation. The house documents were the starting line, a thread to unravel the tapestry of tolerance she'd woven around herself. Dignity wasn't given, it was seized, paper by paper, boundary by boundary. As she slipped into bed that night, the sheets cool against her skin, Mabel didn't pray for forgiveness or understanding. She prayed for clarity, for the strength to see her worth reflected not in their eyes, but in her own. The shift was profound, not in thunderclaps, but in the subtle realignment of her spine, invisible no longer. Mabel Hemsworth was done fading. She was ready to be seen by Lena, by the law, and by the woman in the mirror who still had stories unwritten, pies unbaked, and a life fiercely, finally hers. We'll file the revocation today. I'll notarize it myself. You'll need to sign a few forms, but I'll keep it simple. Mabel nodded, her throat tight but her resolve firmer than ever. As Lena printed the necessary paperwork, Mabel's mind wandered back to the day she'd signed that power of attorney. It had been 3 years ago, after a slippery winter. Sidewalk had sent her tumbling, fracturing her wrist and bruising her pride. Carl had insisted on it then, his concern genuine in the hospital room's sterile light. "Mom, you need someone to handle things if you're laid up." He'd said, his hand warm on hers. She'd agreed without hesitation, seeing It as another thread binding them, another way to trust him with her vulnerabilities. But in the years since, he'd never once referenced it, never checked on her medical updates, never used it to ease her burdens. It had sat dormant, like so much else in their relationship, a formality gathering dust. Now, revoking it felt like severing a lifeline she'd outgrown, one that had become more tether than support. Lena slid the forms across the desk, explaining each clause with the precision of someone who'd navigated these waters many times. Mabel read them carefully, her glasses perched on tip of her nose, then signed with a steady hand, the notary seal stamped down with a satisfying thud, and just like that, Carl's authority evaporated. "It's done," Lena said softly. "No take backs on this one, but I suspect you won't want any." Mabel exhaled, a weight lifting she hadn't fully acknowledged. "Thank you." Now, the will, her voice was even, but inside her heart quickened. This was deeper territory, the core of her legacy, the final say on what she'd built over a lifetime of scrimping, saving, and sacrificing. Lena pulled up a digital template on her computer, her finger flying over the keys. "Tell me what you're thinking. Who stays, who goes?" "Carl goes, completely." The words hung in the air, stark and unyielding. Lena paused, her eyes meeting Mabel's over the screen. "Entirely, as executor and beneficiary." Mabel nodded, pulling a worn brochure from her purse. "Greenway Women's Shelter, its edges frayed from years of being tucked away. He has the house I gave him, a steady job, and his family. He doesn't need more from me, and he's shown me what he values, or rather, what he doesn't." She placed the brochure on the desk. "This place. I stayed there once. Long before Carl was born. After Frank's father passed, things got rough. They gave me a bed, a hot meal, and a way forward. The house, my house, should go to them when I'm gone. Sell it with proceeds in full to the shelter. No family ties." Lena's expression softened, a flicker of understanding crossing her features. She didn't press for details and didn't offer platitudes. Instead, she typed methodically, outlining the changes. Carl was removed as executor, his name stricken from beneficiary lists. The property was transferred into a revocable trust, with clear directives for sale upon Mabel's passing, with all funds directed to the shelter. "You're the trustee for now," Lena explained. "Full control, and we can name a professional executor if you'd like. Someone neutral and efficient." Mabel considered it, then agreed. Yes, no more family obligations. As the new will took shape on the screen, Mabel felt a quiet unraveling. This wasn't vengeance, it was repair, stitching back the pieces of herself she'd handed over too freely. The down payment on Carl's house, the endless casseroles, the silent endurance at family events where she was seated at the children's table or worse. Forgotten altogether, these had been her offerings, given with love but received with indifference. Redirecting her estate to the shelter was an act of reclamation, a way to honor the woman she'd been before motherhood defined her entirely, before she'd learned to fade into the background to keep the peace. Lena printed the draft, and they reviewed it line by line. Mabel's signature flowed across the pages, deliberate and unhurried, each stroke an affirmation. The notary seal came down again, sealing not just the document but a chapter. "If you change your mind," Lena said as she handed Mabel copies stapled neatly, "just call." Doors like this swing both ways, but Mabel knew she wouldn't. "I won't," she replied, folding the papers into her purse with care. Outside, the air felt crisper, the sun filtering through the leaves with a clarity that mirrored her own. She walked to her car. Slowly, the brochure from the shelter tucked beside the will, a talisman of purpose. This wasn't the end of her family ties, not entirely, but it was the end of unconditional surrender. Carl would have his life, built on the foundation she provided, but her future, her legacy, would serve those who'd once lifted her when she needed it most. The Greenway shelter, with its quiet rooms and second chances, would carry forward what she'd earned through her own quiet strength. Back home, Mabel placed the documents in her fireproof box alongside Frank's old watch and a lock of Carl's baby hair, keepsakes, not chains. She brewed tea, strong and unsweetened, and sat at the kitchen table, the weight of the morning settling into something like alignment. Revoking the power of attorney had freed her present, Amending the will secured her future. No more waiting for Carl to step up. No more hoping Jody would soften. She was the architect now, her estate a bridge to women like the one she'd been resilient, overlooked, but unbroken. That evening, as twilight painted the windows gold, Mabel felt a profound shift. The invisibility that had cloaked her for years began to lift. Replaced by a quiet sovereignty, Lena's guidance had been the key, but the turning was all her own. The shelter would benefit, yes, but Mabel benefited mostly, claiming her dignity one legal line at a time. The morning was sharp with purpose as Mabel dressed for her meeting with Lena. She chose her navy slacks and a blouse with mother-of-pearl buttons, the fabric crisp against her skin, a quiet armor for the task ahead. Her hands, steady now despite the ache in her knuckles, tucked the folder labeled Carl's house into her purse alongside her will and the power of attorney document Carl had signed 3 years ago after her fall. That document, meant to ensure her care, had become another thread tying her to a family that no longer saw her. The memory of Jody's words, "Why is she even still alive?" still burned, but today it fueled her, not wounded her. Mabel was done being invisible. With Lena's guidance, she would reclaim her agency, starting with the legal ties that bound her to Carl. Lena's office was a small, orderly space in her home, a room that smelled of lemon polish and peppermint tea, with a desk stacked neatly with files and a mug proclaiming, "I read contracts." Fun. A jar of peppermints sat untouched, a silent witness to serious conversations. Mabel sat across from Lena, the folder open between them, its contents spread like evidence in a trial she hadn't realized she'd been preparing for. Lena, with her silver hair pulled back and glasses perched low, scanned the power of attorney first. Her eyes flicked up, sharp but kind. "This is still active. Carl has decision, making authority over your medical and financial affairs if you're incapacitated. You want to revoke it." Today, Mabel said, her voice steady, though her heart thudded with the weight of the decision. Lena didn't flinch, didn't question. She nodded, pulling a fresh form from a drawer. It's straightforward. "We'll draft a revocation, you'll sign, and I'll notarize." "It'll be done before you leave." Mabel exhaled, the air leaving her like a long-held confession. That document had been a gesture of trust, signed when Carl drove her home from the hospital, his face tight with worry she'd mistaken for care. He'd never followed up, never asked about her recovery, and never checked if the directive still suited her needs. It was another promise left to gather dust, like the cobbler dish she'd brought to the family gathering. As Lena typed, her fingers quick on the keyboard, Mabel's thoughts drifted to the years she'd spent giving, her time, her money, her heart, without expecting repayment. The $40,000 for Carl's house, the late night drives to pick up Ruby from dance, the pies baked for birthdays where she was seated by the trash cans. Each act had been a thread weaving her into their lives, but those threads had frayed, leaving her tethered to a family that laughed at her existence. Revoking the power of attorney wasn't revenge, it was repair, a step toward untangling herself from a role that diminished her. Lena slid the revocation form across the desk. "Read it carefully. This severs Carl's legal authority completely." Mabel read every line, her eyes lingering on the clause that nullified his control. She signed with deliberate strokes, her pen pressing hard enough to leave faint indents on the page beneath. Lena notarized it with a practiced stamp, her expression neutral but her eyes warm. "It's done, filed today. He'll have no say unless you reinstate him." Mabel nodded, a weight lifting, though another waited in the folder. Now the will, Mabel said, pulling out the document she'd drafted a decade ago, when Carl was still her anchor, the son who'd hugged her fiercely after Frank's death. Back then, she'd named him executor and beneficiary of her modest estate, the house she still lived in, the savings she'd scraped together, and the jewelry Frank had given her. It had felt right, natural, a mother's legacy to her only child. But now, after the backyard, after years of being sidelined, that legacy felt like another gift to someone who didn't value her. Lena skimmed the will, her brow creasing slightly. "Carl's set to inherit everything, with Jody as secondary. You want him out entirely." "Yes," Mabel said, the word firm, final. Lena paused, her pen hovering. That's a big shift, Mabel. You're sure? He has a house, a job, and a family. He's made clear what matters to him. Her voice didn't waver, though her chest tightened at the truth of it. Carl's laugh, joining Jody's cruel remark, had been the final note in a years long song of neglect. The birthday cards that stopped coming, the invitations that grew sparse, the way Ruby and Trent ran past her without a glance, these were the measures of her erasure. Lena nodded, opening a new template on her screen. Who takes his place? A new executor, beneficiaries. Mabel hesitated. She hadn't thought that far, hadn't planned beyond severing the ties. I'm not sure yet. Maybe a professional executor, someone who doesn't look through me. Lena made a note, her pen scratching softly. We can appoint a neutral party, a lawyer, a trust company, and the estate itself, who gets it. Mabel reached into her purse, pulling out a worn brochure, its edges soft from years of being tucked away. The Greenway Women's Shelter, a place she'd stayed briefly decades ago, before Carl was born, when she'd fled a shadow of her past life. The shelter had been a lifeline, clean sheets, a locked door, a chance to breathe. This, she said, sliding the brochure across. Sell the house when I'm gone, everything goes to them. Lena's eyes softened, but she didn't comment, just typed the directive into the form. No family inheritance at all. None, Mabel said, and the word felt like a key turning in a long, locked door. The decision wasn't born of spite, though Mabel knew it could look that way. It was about redirecting her legacy to a place that had seen her when she was invisible, a place that understood the weight of starting over. The shelter had given her a room, a voice, and a chance to rebuild when she was younger, frightened, and alone. Now she would give back, not to a family that took her for granted, but to women who needed what she'd once needed: dignity, safety, and a hand up. The house, her home of 43 years, with its sailboat curtains and apple tree, would become a gift to strangers, not a chain to a son who'd forgotten her. Lena worked efficiently, drafting clauses and explaining contingencies. You'll be the trustee and beneficiary of a living trust for now. Upon your passing, the assets liquidate and proceed to the shelter. No loopholes? Mabel listened, nodding, her mind clear despite the enormity of the shift. She signed each page with care, her signature a deliberate act of reclamation. Lena notarized the documents, stapled them neatly, and handed Mabel a slim packet. Keep this safe. If you change your mind, call me. I won't, Mabel said, and she meant it. As she left Lena's office, the air outside felt sharper, like it carried a new edge. The sun was out, but Mabel's weather was her own, a calm resolve that steadied her steps. Back home, she placed the packet in her fireproof box alongside Frank's old letter and her medical directives. The act felt final, not in a mournful way, but like closing a book she'd read too many times. Carl's name was gone from her future, not erased in anger, but removed with intention. She wasn't punishing him. She was freeing herself. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table, the silence no longer heavy but welcoming. She brewed tea, sugar, no milk, and opened a blank notebook. At the top, she wrote Carl, then drew a single line through it, not with force, but with certainty. The Greenway Women's Shelter would carry her name forward, not as a mother taken for granted, but as a woman who chose where her light would shine. Mabel sipped her tea, the warmth spreading through her, and for the first time in years she felt solid, seen by herself, her dignity no longer a gift to be offered, but a truth to be lived. Rain fell in a soft, steady drizzle, painting the world outside Mabel's window in muted grays. She sat at her kitchen table, the familiar oak scarred from years of Carl's homework and her own late night sewing projects. A loaf of banana bread, freshly baked, filled the house with a warm, sweet scent, a ritual she'd reclaimed for herself, not for family gatherings where her offerings went unnoticed. The memory of Jody's cruel remark at the picnic, "Why is she even still alive?" still lingered, but it no longer cut as deeply. Mabel was rewriting her story, step by deliberate step, and the silence of her home felt less like absence and more like space to breathe. Then at 4:12 p.m., a knock came at the door, tentative but unmistakable. Mabel knew it wasn't the postman or Kay from next door. It was Ruby, her granddaughter, standing on the porch in a hoodie 2 sizes too big, sneaker with untied laces, and her eyes rimmed with something heavier than mascara. Mabel opened the door, her heart steady but curious. Ruby shifted, clutching the strap of her backpack, her face a mix of resolve and uncertainty. "I wasn't sure you'd open," she said, her voice small, almost swallowed by the patter of rain. "I wasn't sure you'd knock," Mabel replied, stepping aside to let her in. The air between them was fragile, not hostile, but weighted with unspoken history. Ruby had been part of the family's neglect, her silence at the library, her laughter at Jody's words, and her absence from Mabel's birthday. Yet here she was alone, without Carl or Jody's shadow, her presence a quiet plea. Inside, they sat at the kitchen table, the banana bread between them, its warmth a bridge across the gap. Mabel poured tea, the chipped blue china cups clinking softly as she set them down. Ruby picked at the bread, tearing off small pieces, her fingers restless. "Mom says you're going crazy," she said finally, not unkindly, her eyes fixed on the crumbs, "that you're cutting us out." Mabel sipped her tea, letting the words settle. "I'm not cutting," she said, "I'm choosing." "There's a difference," Ruby nodded, her brow furrowing as if trying to parse a new language. The apology came haltingly, like water trickling over stones. "I'm sorry," Ruby said, her voice cracking, "for the backyard, for laughing when Mom said that, for ignoring you at the library. It wasn't funny. She trailed off, her hands twisting the hem of her hoodie. Mabel didn't rush to fill the silence and didn't offer the quick forgiveness she'd once given so freely. She'd spent years smoothing over slights, excusing neglect with "they're just busy," or "they're young." Not anymore. "What are you sorry for?" she asked, her tone gentle but firm. Ruby's eyes met hers, wide and searching. "For wanting to fit in," she admitted. "I saw how they treated you and I copied it. I didn't question it until I started missing you." The words landed like a stone in still water, rippling through Mabel's chest. Missing her. Not the pies, not the rides to school, not the gifts tucked into Ziploc bags, but her. It was a confession that carried weight, not because it erased the past, but because it was honest, stripped of pretense. Mabel leaned back, her hands wrapped around her cup, the warmth grounding her. "Thank you for calling," she said, choosing her words carefully, "for coming." Ruby's shoulders relaxed, but her eyes stayed wary, as if waiting for a verdict. "Can I see you again?" she asked. "Just me?" Mabel considered her, this girl with Carl's eyes but a spark all her own, a spark that hadn't been fully dimmed by her parents' indifference. "Tomorrow, after school," Mabel said. "Just you." Ruby exhaled, a sound like she'd been holding her breath for months, and nodded. The hour that followed wasn't a flood of reconciliation, but a slow, careful rebuilding. They didn't speak of Carl or Jody, didn't dredge up the backyard or the library. Instead, Ruby talked about school, a boy who'd drawn a beard on his mask and got sent to the principal, an English teacher who said too often. She mentioned a cat she wanted but couldn't have, her voice softening as she described its gray fur and green eyes. Mabel listened, not as the grandmother who'd once been a fixture, but as someone meeting Ruby anew on terms of truth rather than obligation. She offered a second slice of banana bread, wrapped in foil, for Ruby to take home, and when Ruby left, her sneakers squeaking on the wet porch, Mabel felt a flicker of something like hope, not the desperate kind, but the kind that grows in honest soil. The next day, Ruby returned as promised, this time with a small plastic container of chocolate chip cookies slightly misshapen from her backpack. "I made these," she said, shy but proud. They sat again, this time on the porch, the drizzle replaced by a soft evening glow. Ruby pulled out a magazine with a quiz. "What type of flower are you?" and they circled answers in pencil, laughing when Mabel was deemed a lilac, quiet, observant, and easily underestimated. Ruby was a marigold, resilient, hard to root out. "That checks," she said, grinning. It was a small moment, but it felt like a cornerstone, a bond forming not from duty but from choice. Ruby's visits became a quiet rhythm over the weeks. She didn't always bring cookies or apologies, but she brought herself, her sketches, her stories, and her questions. One evening, she unfolded a drawing, rough but deliberate, a woman at a chessboard, 2 pieces against a full set, yet positioned to win. "She's not done," Ruby said. "She's just starting her game." Mabel's throat tightened, not with tears, but with recognition. She asked to hang it in her new apartment, and Ruby's face lit up. Really. Their bond grew not from erasing the past, but from acknowledging it. Ruby didn't pretend her silence at the library hadn't hurt, and Mabel didn't pretend to forgive instantly. Instead, they built on honesty. Ruby admitting she'd followed her parents' lead, Mabel admitting she'd let herself be erased too long. I don't hate you, Mabel told her once as they ate toast with fig jam Ruby had brought. I don't hate you either, Ruby whispered, and the words felt like a vow. This wasn't the family Mabel had once dreamed of, gathered around her table with laughter and warmth. It was better, smaller, truer. Ruby's presence wasn't an obligation. It was a choice, a knock at the door that Mabel answered because it was genuine. When Ruby mentioned her parents, a dad says you're turning your back on family, Mabel didn't flinch. He's hurt, Ruby added. Then he's finally talking about something that matters, Mabel replied, and Ruby nodded, understanding more than she said. As Mabel packed for her move to the new apartment, Ruby helped, taping boxes and wrapping dishes. She didn't ask for the old treasures, the stickers, the notebooks Mabel had once kept for her. Instead, she brought a shoebox of her own keepsakes, a photo of them at the zoo, Ruby's face smeared with chocolate, and a necklace Jody wouldn't like. Stuff I can't keep at home, she said, and Mabel understood. Ruby was choosing her too in her own way, carving out space for a grandmother who'd become more than a memory. The bond they rebuilt was fragile but real, like a bridge made of rope rather than stone. It didn't erase the years of neglect, but it didn't need to. It was enough that Ruby knocked, that Mabel opened the door, and that they sat together with tea and truth. When Ruby left one evening, hugging Mabel tighter than ever, she said, "Marigolds don't pretend." Mabel smiled. Neither do lilacs. The rain had stopped and the world felt wide, not empty. The morning of the move was quiet, the kind of stillness that felt like the world holding its breath. Mabel woke before dawn. The house she'd called home for 43 years, the familiar creaks of the floorboards under her bare feet, a reminder of a life layered with memories. She brewed coffee in her chipped mug, the one Frank had bought at a flea market in '79, and stood in the kitchen, the linoleum cool beneath her soles. The house with its sailboat curtains and apple tree in the backyard had been her anchor through Carl's childhood, Frank's death, and the slow erosion of her place in her family's orbit. But Jody's words at the picnic, "Why is she even still alive?" had shifted something fundamental, and Mabel was no longer tethered to a past that diminished her. Today, she was moving to a modest apartment, a one-bedroom unit at Willow View, where she would embrace a simpler life, one defined by her own choices, not obligations. The movers arrived at 9, two young men with polite nods and quick hands. Surprised by the sparseness of her belongings, Mabel had spent weeks sorting, labeling boxes with precision. Kitchen, keep, closet, donate, memories, and do not open yet. She'd given away the excess. The guest room dresser Carl and Jody had called dated, the holiday tablecloths no one would inherit. The house exhaled as they carried out the last box, its walls bare, its echoes softer. Mabel walked through each room, her fingers grazing the doorframes, not clinging but thanking. In the hallway, she paused at the faint grooves of Carl's height marks, painted over but still palpable under her touch. She didn't cry. Instead, she left a note in the top drawer with a single key. "This house taught me everything. Thank you." Then she locked the door and walked away, her steps light, unburdened. The apartment at Willow View was simpler than the brochure promised, but it felt right, brick walls, tidy flower beds, and a linden tree shading a bench outside. Unit 1B smelled of fresh paint and possibility, its south, facing windows catching the morning light. Teresa, the manager, greeted her with a welcome packet and a small succulent in a cat-shaped pot. "Something green for your windowsill," she said. Mabel placed it by the kitchen sink, whispering, "I think we'll get along." The movers arranged her boxes as directed, and she tipped them generously, not caring about the cost. This was her beginning, not a transaction. The first thing Mabel unpacked was her kettle, its familiar whistle, a grounding note in the new space. The second was Ruby's sketch, a pencil drawing of a woman at a chessboard, two pieces poised to win against a full set. She hung it near the window, where the light softened its lines, making it glow like a promise. That night, she made toast on the balcony, wrapped in a blanket, the hum of a neighbor's television faint through the wall. The world was quiet, but not empty. Mabel felt spacious, not lost, her life no longer crowded with expectations she couldn't meet. The apartment was small, a single bedroom, a compact kitchen with a humming fridge, and a living area just big enough for a couch and a lamp. The laminate counter wasn't marble, but it was hers, clean and unclaimed by anyone else's story. Mabel embraced the simplicity, not as a diminishment, but as a distillation. She didn't need 3 bedrooms or an attic sewing room anymore. She needed space to be herself, not the mother, grandmother, or giver she'd been molded into. The first morning, she baked banana bread not for an occasion or a guest, but because she loved the way the oven warmed the air, the scent of sugar and spice curling through the rooms. She ate a slice standing by the sink, crumbs falling onto a napkin, and smiled. This was for her. Hosting friends came naturally, a reclaiming of connection on her terms. The first Sunday, she invited Marcia, Ida, and Nora, women from her old life, from church choirs and book clubs, who'd stayed in touch despite the years. They didn't bring food, though they offered. Mabel insisted it wasn't about that. She baked a spice cake, simple but rich, and sliced it into even wedges with one left over. They sat by the windows, the afternoon light pale and soft, sipping tea from her chipped blue china. No one mentioned Carl, Jody, or the house she'd left. Instead, they talked of shoulder pain, grocery prices, and small joys. Ida's story of a bus driver who waited for her, Marcia's niece engaged to a boy with cartoon whale socks, and Nora's pitch for a library poetry group. The conversation dipped into quiet at times. Not awkward but full, the kind that comes when women over 70 share warm things together. Mabel felt a peace she hadn't known in years, not the fleeting kind tied to family approval, but a steady calm rooted in chosen connections. These women saw her, not as Carl's mother or Ruby's grandmother, but as Mabel with her sharp wit and quiet strength. When they left, they washed cups, wrapped the extra cake in foil, and promised to return. The apartment held their laughter, its walls no longer echoing with absence but humming with presence. She baked for herself often, not out of habit but delight. A blueberry pie with lemon zest and a batch of scones dusted with sugar, each recipe a small act of self-love. She ate on the balcony, her feet tucked under her, a book open but often ignored as she watched the linden tree sway. The simplicity of it, tea, bread, a view of a world that didn't demand her sacrifice, was a revelation. She'd spent decades baking for others, her kitchen a stage for their needs. Now it was her sanctuary where she measured flour for her own joy. Ruby's visits wove into this new rhythm, not as an obligation but as a thread of honest connection. She'd come with cookies or a sketch, sitting cross-legged on the floor, talking of school or her dreams of a cat. One evening she brought a shoebox of keepsakes, a photo of them at the zoo, a necklace Jody wouldn't approve of, saying, "Stuff I can't keep at home." Mabel didn't press, she understood. Ruby was choosing her. Just as Mabel was choosing herself, their bond, rebuilt on truth, was a quiet anchor in her simpler life. The apartment became a canvas for Mabel's rediscovery. She hung no family photos save one of her and Frank, paints, splattered and laughing after painting the old porch. She kept a tin of buttons, a quilt she'd finish someday, and Frank's letter from before his surgery. "Stay open, stay warm, live with your hands unclenched." She read it often, tucking it beside her will, a reminder of her strength. The succulent thrived by the sink, leaning toward the light, much like Mabel herself. Peace came not as a grand gesture, but as a series of small ones. A morning without waiting for a call, an evening with friends who stayed for the company, not the food. The apartment, modest as it was, held her fully. No ghosts of neglect, no echoes of Jody's laughter. Mabel's life was simpler now, but richer, filled with connections she chose, not inherited. She was no longer the woman by the trash cans, tolerated at someone else's table. She'd set her own, and it was enough. The morning of her 73rd birthday dawned without fanfare, the sky a soft gray with the promise of rain humming in distance. Mabel woke in her modest apartment at Willowview, the silence of the space not heavy but restful, like a deep breath after a long climb. She lay still for a moment, her eyes tracing the familiar cracks in the ceiling, no longer those of the old house where she'd raised Carl, mourned Frank, and waited for a family that forgot her. The memory of Jody's cruel remark at the picnic, "Why is she even still alive?" had once cut deep, but now it was a distant echo, a marker of the moment she'd chosen to stop fading. Today, on her 73rd birthday, Mabel reflected on her journey, no longer tethered to her family's approval, living for herself with a quiet, hard, one strength. She rose slowly, her joints creaking but her movements deliberate, and padded to the kitchen in her robe, the one with frayed cuffs she hadn't replaced because it felt like an old friend. The apartment was small, a single bedroom, a compact kitchen with a humming fridge, a living area lit by south facing windows, but every inch was hers, chosen, not inherited. She brewed coffee in her chipped mug, the one Frank had picked out at a flea market decades ago, and decided on 2 small pancakes drizzled with honey and topped with slices of a pear she'd bought on impulse. She ate at the table by the window, the morning light soft through clean curtains, and savored the sweetness, not because it was her birthday but because she could. No balloons, no rushed texts from relatives, no brunch invitations that carried the weight of obligation, just her, the pancakes, and the quiet joy of a life reclaimed. Mabel's journey had been one of unraveling and rebuilding, a slow untangling from the roles she'd worn too long, the mother who gave without question, the grandmother who waited for scraps of affection. Jody's words at the picnic had been the spark, but the fire had been building for years. Through Carl's silences, Ruby's averted glances, and the family gatherings where she was seated by the trash cans, tolerated but not cherished, she'd spent decades pouring herself into others, the $40,000 for Carl's house, the pies baked for birthdays she wasn't truly part of, and the drawer of stickers and notebooks kept for grandchildren who no longer stopped to say grandma. The realization of her invisibility had hurt, but it had also woken her. She was done waiting for a seat at a table that wasn't set for her. The move to Willow View had been the first concrete step, a shedding of the old house's weight, its sailboat curtains, its apple tree, its memories of a boy who'd once needed her but now laughed at her existence. She'd packed lightly, keeping only what strengthened her, a tin of buttons, a quilt she'd finish someday, and Ruby's sketch of a woman at a chessboard, poised to win with just 2 pieces. The apartment was simple, its laminate counters and humming fridge were unpretentious, but it was a canvas for her new life. She baked for herself now, banana bread, blueberry pies, scones, dusted with sugar not for approval but for joy. She hosted friends, Marcia, Ida, and Nora, who came for tea and stories, their laughter filling the space with warmth that didn't demand her sacrifice. Reflecting on this, Mabel felt a quiet pride, not the loud kind that needed validation, but the kind that settled into her bones like a well-earned rest. She'd revoked Carl's power of attorney, removed him from her will, and redirected her estate to the Greenway Women's Shelter, a place that had once given her refuge. The house she'd lived in for 43 years had sold, its proceeds donated to women who, like her younger self, left with nothing but courage. These weren't acts of vengeance but of intention, a reclaiming of her dignity from a family that had taken it for granted. Carl's letter, arriving a week ago, sat in a drawer. I'm sorry. I don't know how to fix this. Neither forgiven nor rejected, just held in a space where apologies could rest without demanding her response. Ruby was the exception, the one thread of family Mabel hadn't cut. Her granddaughter's apology, halting but honest, had rebuilt a bond based on truth, not obligation. Ruby's visits, bringing cookies, sketches, and stories of school, were a light in Mabel's new life, not because they filled a void but because they were chosen. On this birthday, Ruby arrived at noon, clutching red tulips still in their florist's sleeve. "You're not a birthday cake person," she said, grinning, "so I brought flowers like grown-ups do." She handed Mabel a hand-painted card showing 2 chairs on a porch, one with a teacup. Inside, "Thanks for keeping a seat for me." They drank tea, ate toast, and talked about Ruby's exams, her summer job at the shelter, and her plan for a school support group for kids who felt homeless. "At home, can I use your name?" she asked, only for something true. Mabel replied, and Ruby laughed, a sound that warmed the room like sunlight. Mabel's strength wasn't loud or defiant. It was the quiet resolve of a woman who'd stopped seeking permission to exist. She thought of Frank's letter, tucked beside her will. "Stay open, stay warm, live with your hands unclenched." She had, not by clinging to the past, but by letting it go. The old house with its height marks and memories was gone, but she didn't miss it. She missed the idea of it, the boy Carl had been, the family she dreamed of, but not the reality that sidelined her. Her new life was smaller but fuller, each choice deliberate, the succulent by the sink, thriving despite early wilting, the journal where she wrote, "I am not waiting at windows, not watching porches." That afternoon, Marcia and Ida came, bringing cherry pie and stories of knees and politics. Nora, sidelined by a cold, sent a crossword with a note. 12 down made me think of you. The answer was anchor, and Mabel smiled, feeling the words weight. They laughed, sipped tea from her chipped china, and left with promises to return. After they were gone, Mabel stood in doorway, listening to the apartment's new noise, warm, chosen, alive. The rain had started, a soft percussion on the roof, and she didn't feel alone. Later, she sat on the balcony with a book she'd meant to read for 15 years, reading 3 chapters before setting it down, not because she was tired, but because she didn't need to prove she could finish. She'd mailed a donation to a legal fund for elder women and planted basil in a clay pot and watched it lean toward the light. Carl's text arrived. "Happy birthday, Mom. I didn't send a card. I haven't earned that yet." And she let it sit unanswered, not out of anger, but because some apologies need only to land. Her strength was in living, not responding. At dusk, Mabel wrote in her journal, the last page of a volume she'd filled with truths. They asked why I'm still alive, to remember my name, to set my own table, to keep the door open for those who knock with clean hands. She closed the book, turned out the light, and slept, her heart steady, her life her own.